Mr. Price here to read you Chapter 3 of The Cay by Theodore Taylor. So, if you remember, we left off where the main character Philip and his mother were leaving the island of Caraco because his mother was fearing for their safety. And they boarded a ship called the SS Hato and headed off at the end of the last chapter. And that's where we pick up at the start of Chapter 3. So here we go. We were torpedoed at about 3 o'clock in the morning of April 6th, 1942, 2 days after leaving Panama. I was thrown from the top bunk and suddenly found myself on my hands and knees on the deck. We could hear the ship's whistle blowing constantly, and there were sounds of metal wrenching and much shouting. The whole ship was shuddering. It felt as though we'd stopped and were dead in the water. My mother was very calm. Not at all like she was at home. She talked quietly while she got dressed, telling me to tie my shoes, and to be certain to carry my wool sweater, and to put on my leather jacket. Her hands were not shaking. She helped me put on my life jacket, and then she put hers on, saying, "Now remember, everything we were told about abandoning ship. The officers had held drills every day." As she was speaking, there was another violent explosion. We were thrown against the cabin door, which the steward had warned us not to lock because it might become jammed. We pushed it open and went out to the boat deck, which was already beginning to tilt. Everything was bright red, and there were great crackling noises. The entire after part of the ship was on fire, and sailors were launching the lifeboat that was on our deck. Steam lines had broken, and steam was hissing out. Heat from the fire washed over us. When the lifeboat had been swung out, the captain came down from the bridge. He was a small, wiry, white-haired man, and was acting the way I'd been told captains should act. He stood by the lifeboat in the fire's glow, very alert, giving orders to the crew. He was carrying a briefcase and a navigation instrument I knew to be a sextant. On the other side of the ship, another lifeboat was being launched. Near us, 2 sailors with axes chopped at lines, and 2 big life rafts plunged toward the water. Which looked black except for pools of fire from the burning fuel oil. The captain shouted, "Get a move on! Passengers, into the boats!" Tins of lubricating oil in the afterholds had ignited and were exploding, but the ones forward had not been exposed to the fire. A sailor grabbed my mother's hand and helped her in, and then I felt myself being passed into the hands of a sailor on the boat. The other passengers were helped in, and someone yelled, "Lower away!" At that moment, the Hato lurched heavily, and something happened to the boat falls. The bow tilted downward, and the next thing I knew, we were all in the water. I saw my mother near me and yelled to her. Then something hit me from above. A long time later, 4 hours, I was told, I opened my eyes to see blue sky above. It moved back and forth, and I could hear the slap of water. I had a terrible pain in my head. I closed my eyes again, thinking maybe I was dreaming. Then a voice said, "Young boss, how are you feeling?" I turned my head. I saw a huge, very old black man sitting on the raft near me. He was ugly. His head was a mass of wiry gray hair. For a moment, I could not figure out where I was or who he was. Then I remembered seeing him working with the deck gang of the Hato. I looked around for my mother, but there was no one else on the raft. Just this huge man, myself, and a big black and gray cat that was licking his haunches. The black man said, "You had a most terrible crack on the head, boss. A strong back glancing off the head. I hurl you aboard this raft." He crawled over toward me. His face couldn't have been blacker or his teeth whiter. They made an alabaster trench in his mouth. He had a big welt, like a scar on his left cheek. I knew he was West Indian. I had seen many of them in Willemstad, but he was the biggest one I'd ever seen. I sat up, asking, "Where are we? Where is my mother?" The man shook his head with a frown. "I true believe your mother is safe and sound on a raft like this, or maybe they hurl her into the boat. I true believe that." Then he smiled at me, his face becoming less terrifying. "As to our very location, I must guess we are somewhere round the Cays. somewhere maybe 15 latitude and 80 long. We should have passed them till that most treacherous torpedo split the very hull. 2 minutes down, at most. I looked all around at us. There was nothing but blue sea with occasional patches of orange-brown seaweed. No sight of the Hato, or other rafts, or boats. Just the sea, and a few birds that wheeled over it. That lonely sea, and the sharp pains in my head, and the knowledge that I was here, alone with a man instead of my mother, made me break into tears. Finally, the man said, looking at me from bloodshot eyes, "Now, young boss, I most feel like that my own self, Timothy, but 'twould be of no particular use to do that, eh?" His voice was rich calypso, soft and musical, the words rubbing off like velvet. I felt a little better, but my head ached fiercely. He nodded toward the cat. "This is Stu, the cook's cat. He climbed on the raft, and I had no heart to throw him off." Stu was still busy licking. He got oil all over hisself from the water. I looked closer at the man. He was extremely old, yet he seemed powerful. Muscles rippled over the ebony of his arms and around his shoulders. His chest was thick, and his neck was the size of a small tree trunk. I looked at his hands and feet. The skin was alligatored and cracked, tough from age and walking barefoot on the hot decks of schooners and freighters. He saw me examining him and said gently, "Put your head back down, young boss, and rest a while longer. Do not look direct at the sun. 'Tis too powerful." I felt seasick and crawled to the side to vomit. He came up beside me, holding my head in his great clamshell hands. It didn't matter at that moment the color of his skin. He murmured, "This be good, this be good." I want to stop right there, and Philip is having some really uncomfortable thoughts. You know, he's judging this man that he's met by the color of his skin. But one of the things that I was raised with my family by is this idea that actions speak louder than words. So here Philip is feeling sick and throwing up, and this man that he just met, who pulled him aboard this raft and saved his life, comes up to him and holds his head in he describes his great clamshell hands to help him out when he's vomiting. So right away, these actions, these character actions, reveal a lot about this character Timothy as he has just introduced himself. So you know, keep that in mind as we're reading the story. Character actions mean a lot. When it was over, he helped me back to the center of the raft, saying, "'Tis most natural for you to do this. 'Tis the shock of having this most terrible thing happen." I then watched as he used his powerful arms and hands to rip up boards from the outside edges of the raft. He pounded them back together on cleats, forming two triangles. Then he jammed the bases into slots between the raft boards. He stripped off his shirt and his pants and demanded mine. I don't know what happened to my leather jacket or my sweater, but soon we had a flimsy shelter from the burning sun. Crawling under it to sprawl beside me, he said, "We have rare good luck, young boss. The water keg did not bust when the raft was launched, and we have a few biscuit and some chocolate, and the matches in the tin is dry. So we have rare good luck." He grinned at me then. I was thinking that our luck wasn't so good. I was thinking about my mother on another boat or raft, not knowing that I was all right. I was thinking about my father back in Willemstad. It was terrible not to be able to tell him where I was. He'd have boats and planes out within hours. I guess the man saw the look on my face. He said, "Do not despair, young boss. Someone will find us. Many schooner go by this way, and this also be the ship track to Jamaica and on." After a bit, lulled by the bobbing of the raft and by the soft, pleasant sounds of the sea against the old barrel floats, I went to sleep again. I was very tired and my head still ached. The piece of timber must have struck a glancing blow on the left side. When I next awakened, it was late afternoon. The sun had edged down and the breeze across us was cool, but I felt very hot and the pain had not gone away. The man was sitting with his back toward me, humming something in calypso. His back was a great wall of black flesh. I saw a cruel scar on one shoulder. I asked, "What's your name?" Hearing my voice, he turned with a wide grin. "Ah, you are back with me. It has been lonesome these very hours." I repeated, "What's your name?" "My own self, Timothy." "Your last name?" He laughed. "I have but one name. 'Tis Timothy." "Mine is Philip. Philip Enright, Timothy. My father had always taught me to address anyone I took to be an adult as Mr. But Timothy didn't seem to be a mister. He said, "I knew a Philip who fish out of St. John, but an outrageous man he was." He laughed deep inside himself. I asked him for a drink of water. He nodded agreeably, saying, "The sun do parch." He lifted a hinged section of the raft flooring and drew out the keg, which was about 2 feet long. There was a tin cup lashed to it. "Careful not to spill a drop," he said. "'Tis best to have only an outrageous small amount, just enough to wet the tongue." "Why?" I asked. "That's a large keg." He scanned the barren sea and then looked back at me, his old eyes growing remote. "The large keg have a way of losing its very size." "You said we would be picked up soon," I reminded him. "Ah, yes," he said instantly, "but we must be wise about what we have." I drank the tiny amount of water he poured out and asked for more. He regarded me silently a moment, then said, his eyes squinting, "A very little more, young boss." My lips were parched and my throat was dry. I wanted a whole cup. "Please fill it up," I said. Timothy poured only a few drops into the bottom. "It isn't enough," I complained. I felt I could drink 3 cups of it, but he pressed the wooden stopper firmly back into the keg, ignoring me. I said, "I must have water, Timothy. I'm very hot." Without answering, he opened the trap of the raft and secured the keg again. It was then I began to learn what a stubborn old man he could be. I began to dislike Timothy. "Young boss," he said, coming back under the shelter, "maybe before tonight a schooner will pass this way, and if that happens, you may drink the whole keg. Maybe the schooner will not pass this way, so we must make our water last." I said defiantly, "A schooner will find us, and my father has ships out looking for us." Without even glancing at me, he answered, "True, young boss." Then he closed his eyes and would not even speak to me anymore. He just sprawled out, a mound of silent flesh. I couldn't hold the tears back. I'm sure he heard me, but he didn't move a muscle of his face. Neither did he look up when I crawled out from under the shelter to get as far away from him as I could. I stayed on the edge of the raft for a long time, thinking about home and rubbing Stu Cat's back. Although I hadn't thought so before, I was now beginning to believe that my mother was right. She didn't like them. She didn't like it when Henrik and I would go down to St. Anna Bay and play near the schooners. But it was always fun. They would always laugh at us and toss us bananas or papayas. She'd say that she knew where we'd been. "They're not the same as you, Philip. They're different and they live differently. That's the way it must be." Henrik, who'd grown up in Caraca with them, couldn't understand why my mother felt this way. I yelled over at him, "You're saving all the water for yourself!" I don't think he was asleep, but he didn't answer. I'm running a little long on this video, guys, so there's going to be a very, very short part 2 following this one directly. I apologize.